Close your eyes and imagine yourself drifting backward in time. The modern world around you begins to fade. The sound of cars, the glow of screens, the rush of a morning alarm. Instead, you awaken in a world that feels both strange and familiar. A world where life was slower, harsher, yet filled with rituals and rhythms that governed every dawn. This is the medieval morning, the threshold between darkness and light, where breakfast, or the lack of it, carried meanings far beyond food. It is early, the air still heavy with the chill of night. The first sounds are not the hum of electricity, but the distant tolling of a church bell, echoing over fields and stone walls. A rooster calls sharp and insistent, announcing that daylight is near. The world stirs awake in scattered fragments. The crackle of a fire coaxed to life, the shuffle of straw on a cottage floor, the soft murmur of a prayer whispered into the stillness. The smell of wood smoke drifts through the damp morning air. Homes built of timber and thatch hold the faint scent of last night's embers. In a peasant's cottage, the hearth is the heart of the household, where both warmth and sustenance are born. The mother of the family kneels, striking flint against steel, sparks leaping until they catch on a bundle of kindling. Slowly flames rise, their glow illuminating faces etched with wariness but softened by routine. The first meal of the day is never guaranteed. Unlike our modern certainty of cereal, toast or coffee, the medieval dawn offers only what can be spared from yesterday, or what can be coaxed quickly from the land. A heel of coarse bread, hardened overnight, but softened by dipping it in ale. A ladle of thin pottage, reheated from the pot that never truly empties. Perhaps a small piece of cheese, salty and sharp, wrapped in cloth to survive the night. But in this world, breakfast is not simply a matter of hunger. It is shadowed by ideas of morality, of sin, of discipline. To eat too soon was often seen as indulgent, even suspicious. The word breakfast itself, to break the night's fast, carried with it layers of cultural meaning. For the church, the great authority of medieval life, breaking the fast before noon might suggest weakness of spirit. For the laborer, however, the body demanded strength before the day's toil in fields and workshops. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a village green. On one side, peasants ready their tools, wooden plows, sickles, baskets for carrying grain or vegetables. Their stomachs grumble, and though a small meal might steady their hands, they know that too much food too early would be frowned upon. On the other side of the village, the parish priest has already risen for prayer. He eats nothing, instead lifting his voice in chants that echo inside the stone church, his hunger transformed into devotion. The divide is clear. For some, breakfast is necessity, for others it is temptation. The sun creeps higher, painting the horizon in shades of pale gold. Light filters through narrow windows, through the gaps in shutters, through cracks in walls of wattle and daub. In towns, merchants prepare their stalls, arranging bread, cheese and dried fish. The aroma mingles with the tang of damp earth, and the sharper smells of livestock. Even here, before trade begins, the question of food stirs beneath every action. Will the day begin with nourishment, or with endurance? Step inside a noble's hall, and the contrast sharpens. Stone walls rise tall and echoing, banners hang with embroidered crests, and servants move quietly across the floor. For nobles, the morning could bring indulgence, honey dripping from combs, fresh milk, warmed by the hearth, slices of cold roasted meat, left from the previous night's feast. Yet even among the wealthy, breakfast was not always guaranteed. Some chose to abstain, aligning themselves with the ideals of discipline and restraint. Others indulged, letting their power speak through the abundance on their plates. And so medieval mornings were woven with contradiction. Hunger pressed heavily, yet restraint was praised. Food was everywhere, yet its consumption carried moral weight. Every bite of bread, every sip of ale, carried with it unspoken meaning. As you listen, allow yourself to imagine the textures of this world, the rough grain of barley bread against your fingers, the warmth of a clay mug filled with small ale, weak but sustaining, the soft bleating of sheep outside the window, the clatter of hooves on a dirt road, the hush of prayers spoken in Latin by a monk who has not eaten since yesterday. These sensations bring us closer to understanding why medieval breakfasts were not just meals, but moments of tension, reflection, and survival. In many ways, the medieval morning was a mirror of society itself. The poor and the rich, the devout and the practical, the hungry and the disciplined, all revealed themselves in how they greeted the dawn. The suspicion of breakfast, the strangeness of eating too early, marked a world both distant and familiar. For as strange as these traditions may seem, they were rooted in timeless questions. When should we eat? Why do we eat? And what does food mean beyond its power to fill the belly? As the first section of our journey draws to a close, we stand at the threshold. We have entered a world where the morning is heavy with meaning, where even the humblest piece of bread can spark questions of faith, necessity, and identity. From this foundation, we will travel deeper into the strange traditions of medieval breakfast, uncovering the rules, the rituals, and the contradictions that shaped how people began their day. For now, hold on to the image, the crackling hearth, the ringing of distant bells, the faint taste of coarse bread dipped in ale. This is the world of the medieval morning, a world both strange and wondrous, a world that waits quietly for the sun to rise. In the medieval world, food was never just food. Every meal was tied to questions of morality, status, and the eternal struggle between body and soul. Breakfast, the earliest meal of the day, carried a burden of suspicion heavier than any loaf of bread or cup of ale. To rise with the sun and eat immediately was not always considered natural. In fact, for centuries many believed it was sinful. Imagine once again the first light of dawn spreading across the land. A laborer, his body weary from years of toil, wakes in his small wooden cottage. His stomach growls, and his hands tremble slightly as he reaches for yesterday's bread, hardened but edible. Yet in the quiet of the morning, he hesitates, not because the bread is scarce, but because of what the act might mean. To eat so early, before the day's work has even begun, might be read as weakness, an indulgence of the flesh rather than the strength of the spirit. The church, whose influence shaped nearly every aspect of medieval life, often cast a suspicious eye on the morning meal. To break one's fast before noon was to risk appearing greedy or slothful. In sermons, priests warned that early eating fed not only the body, but also the sins of gluttony and laziness. Fasting, by contrast, was a way to tame desire, to show God that one's spirit could rise above the hunger of the flesh. This was more than religious teaching, it was a cultural expectation. To eat too soon was to admit that the body ruled over the soul, and so in villages and towns across Europe, breakfast became something of a moral battleground. Picture a monk in a cold stone monastery, rising in the grey light of dawn. He shivers in his robe as he moves through the cloister, joining his brothers in morning chants. His stomach rumbles, but he does not eat. The hunger is not seen as suffering, but as devotion. Each growl of his belly is a reminder of sacrifice, a silent prayer of endurance. To him, the denial of breakfast is not deprivation, it is strength. Now picture in the same moment a peasant standing in a muddy field. He must plow, plant, or harvest before the sun climbs too high. His muscles need fuel, his body demands strength. To him, skipping breakfast feels less like piety and more like punishment. And so quietly, before his day begins, he eats a crust of bread or drinks a cup of weak ale. His faith teaches one thing, but his survival teaches another. This tension between body and soul, between necessity and discipline, defined medieval breakfast traditions. Suspicion came not only from the church, but also from social hierarchies. For nobles and elites, skipping breakfast could be a sign of refinement, proof that they were not bound by bodily hunger like common laborers. To eat too early was to reveal one's dependence, one's weakness. The ability to wait until the grand meal of midday became a kind of silent boast. But hunger has a way of making itself heard, and so even as moralists and priests spoke against the morning meal, exceptions abounded. Children, travelers, and the sick were often excused. Workers in the fields might eat secretly, keeping their small meal hidden from judgment. And nobles themselves, though outwardly pious, sometimes indulged in early feasts when they desired. The suspicion of breakfast was strong, but it was never absolute. To understand this suspicion, we must look at the medieval view of time itself. The day was divided by the church's hours of prayer: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, and so on. Noon, marked by sext, was seen as the natural moment to break the fast, when both the body and the spirit had endured the proper test of patience. Anything earlier disrupted this sacred rhythm. Breakfast then was not just a question of hunger, but of time, discipline, and the order of the universe as understood by medieval minds. There is also something deeply human in this story. Imagine the inner conflict of a villager kneeling in church at dawn. His mind drifts not to the Latin words of prayer, but to the smell of bread baking in a nearby oven. His belly aches, and he wonders if one bite would truly harm his soul. In that moment, he lives at the crossroads of desire and duty, of need and faith. Such quiet struggles were the unseen fabric of medieval life. The suspicion of breakfast also reveals much about the medieval relationship to food as a whole. Meals were not routine conveniences, as they are for us today. They were moments of meaning, framed by ritual, prayer, and hierarchy. To eat was to participate in a moral act. It could uplift the soul or endanger it. It could demonstrate virtue or reveal weakness. And so even something as simple as a morning crust of bread became tangled in questions of sin, discipline, and identity. And yet the story is not one of pure denial. Over time, cracks appeared in this rigid suspicion. Hunger pressed too strongly, life demanded too much. By the late Middle Ages, breakfast began to gain cautious acceptance, though still shadowed by its earlier reputation. But in the centuries before that shift, the morning meal remained a source of unease, a practice both necessary and mistrusted. Think of it this way: in our world today, to eat breakfast is a sign of order, health, even virtue. We are told it is the most important meal of the day. But in the medieval world, that same act might have been seen as indulgent, weak, or sinful. This stark contrast reminds us how culture shapes even the most basic human needs. As this section draws to a close, we leave behind the unease that shadowed every medieval dawn. The suspicion of breakfast was more than a rule, it was a mirror, reflecting the values, fears, and aspirations of an age. To eat too soon was to risk gluttony, to yield to the flesh. To wait was to prove discipline, to show devotion. And between those two choices lay the quiet struggles of countless souls, rising each morning to face hunger, faith, and the judgment of their world. In the next part of our journey, we will step more closely into the lives of peasants at dawn, those who worked the hardest, hungered the most, and yet carried on with simple, enduring breakfasts of bread, ale, and survival. Their story reveals how necessity always challenged suspicion, and how the body's needs often won over the ideals of the church. The heart of medieval life beat strongest not in castles or cloisters, but in the humble cottages of peasants. These were the men and women who tilled the fields, harvested the grain, raised the livestock, and built the very foundation of society. And at dawn, before the long labor of the day began, their mornings were filled with a quiet ritual of survival. Imagine a small cottage, its walls of wattle and daub, patched against the chill. The floor is strewn with straw, the roof low and thatched. A faint glow flickers from the hearth, as smoke curls through a hole in the ceiling. A family stirs in the dim light, parents, children, perhaps a grandparent or two, all rising not from soft beds, but from straw pallets laid close to the fire. The day begins not with leisure, but with necessity. Breakfast for peasants was simple and unchanging. Coarse bread, made from rye or barley, heavy and dark, was the cornerstone of survival. Wheat, finer and softer, was reserved for the wealthy. The bread of the poor was dense, sometimes mixed with beans, oats, or even ground acorns when harvests were bad. Its crust could be hard enough to dull a knife, its flavor sour from long fermentation. Yet in each rough slice lay the strength to endure another day's toil. Alongside bread came ale, brewed weak so that it could be consumed daily, without dangerous intoxication. Known as small ale, it was safer than water, which often carried disease. Even children drank it, their mugs filled not with milk or juice, but with a frothy, mild liquid that sustained rather than stupefied. To peasants, ale in the morning was not indulgence, it was survival. The calories, the liquid, the faint warmth it carried into the belly, were as vital as the bread itself. At times there might be more, a spoonful of pottage, simmered in the cauldron, a thin stew of grains, beans, cabbage, onions, or whatever scraps could be spared. The cauldron was rarely emptied, it hung over the fire day after day, its contents replenished with whatever could be found. A ladle in the morning might hold the taste of yesterday's turnips, tomorrow's beans, and a faint memory of meat, long since eaten. This humble dish, ever-changing, was the lifeblood of peasant homes. Picture a father, his hands already calloused, breaking a piece of bread to share with his children. He dips it into the pottage, softening its edges, then hands it to the youngest, whose eyes brighten at the simple meal. A mug of ale is passed. Each family member takes a sip before it is returned to the hearthside table. There is little talk, for the day's work presses upon them. Yet in these few moments of eating, there is a kind of peace, a ritual as old as the land itself. Outside the fields await. The oxen must be yoked, the plough driven through stubborn soil, the weeds pulled before they strangle the grain. For women the day begins with tending animals, spinning wool, or grinding more grain at the mill. Children fetch water, gather wood, chase geese from the garden. Every task demands strength, and so the morning meal, however small, is essential. Without it the body falters long before the sun reaches its peak. But even this modest meal could not always be counted on. In times of famine, when rains ruined the harvest or armies trampled the fields, breakfast might vanish entirely. Families stretched what little they had, grinding bark, weeds or even straw into their bread, to ward off starvation. The ale might be watered down beyond nourishment, the pottage thinned until it was little more than hot water flavored with memory. Hunger became not just a passing discomfort, but a constant companion, and yet there is resilience in this story. Despite the hardship, peasants adapted. They rose with the dawn, ate what they could, and carried on with work that sustained kingdoms. Their mornings were not leisurely feasts, but quiet testaments to endurance. The bread may have been coarse, the ale weak, but together they carried men and women through hours of labor that would exhaust most of us today. Contrast this with the suspicion of breakfast held by the church and the elite. For the peasant, eating in the morning was not gluttony, it was necessity. To plow a field on an empty stomach was to risk collapse. To harvest grain under the summer sun without fuel was to court death. The ideals of fasting might have held sway in monasteries and noble halls, but in the cottage at dawn, survival demanded otherwise. Hunger did not wait for noon prayers. Hunger knew no sermons. There is something profoundly human in these mornings. Imagine the warmth of the fire, the smell of baking bread mingling with wood smoke, the taste of ale that is faintly sour, but refreshing. Imagine a child clutching a crust as though it were treasure, or a mother stirring the pottage with quiet determination, knowing it must last the day. These moments remind us that history is not only about battles and kings, but about families rising in the half-light, eating together before the weight of the day begins. In many villages, breakfast was not a private affair. Neighbors might share what they had, a wedge of cheese, a handful of apples, an extra loaf baked in the communal oven. Generosity was a shield against scarcity, for famine spared no one. A gift today might mean survival tomorrow. The bonds of community, woven as tightly as the fields they tilled, often began with such humble offerings at dawn, and so the peasant's breakfast was both fragile and enduring, humble yet powerful. It was a reminder that life, at its core, is not about luxury, but about sustaining the body and the spirit enough to face another day. In the coarse bread, in the small ale, in the bubbling cauldron of pottage, lay the strength of a people who carried the weight of a civilization upon their shoulders. As we step back from the cottage, leaving behind the crackling fire and the simple meal, we see how the suspicion of breakfast faded before the demands of life. For peasants there was no moral debate. There was only work, hunger, and the daily rhythm of survival. Their breakfasts may not have been celebrated in song or scripture, but without them, the fields would have remained untilled, the harvest unclaimed, the kingdoms unfed. In the next part of our journey, we will walk into the cloisters of monasteries, where men of faith turned hunger into devotion. Their breakfast was not a matter of bread and ale, but of silence, prayer, and the struggle between body and soul. If peasants ate to survive, monks abstained to transcend, two worlds divided by purpose, yet joined by the same rising sun. The monastery awakens not with the clatter of tools, or the rumble of oxen, but with silence. Within stone walls, cold and echoing, the rhythm of life is measured not by hunger or labor, but by prayer. The day begins long before dawn, when the bells call brothers from their narrow cells. Their bodies are weary, their stomachs empty, yet their steps carry them with quiet purpose into the chapel. Imagine the scene. The chapel glows faintly with candlelight, shadows dancing against vaulted arches. The monks gather in rows, their rough woolen robes brushing the stone floor. Their voices rise in chant, low, steady, echoing, weaving Latin hymns into the stillness of night. The sound is solemn, otherworldly, as though the stones themselves were singing. Yet behind each voice lies the quiet gnaw of hunger, for these men will not eat until noon. For monks the absence of breakfast was not deprivation, but discipline. It was an offering, a way to purify the soul by denying the body. Fasting, especially in the morning, aligned them with the sacrifice of Christ, who endured suffering without complaint. To resist the growl of an empty stomach was to prove devotion, to place spirit above flesh. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, and followed by countless monastic communities, emphasized moderation, prayer and restraint. Meals were carefully structured, one in the middle of the day, another in the evening. To eat at dawn would disrupt the order, weaken the discipline, and risk indulgence. Hunger was seen not as an enemy, but as a companion on the path to holiness. Picture a young novice, newly entered into monastic life. He wakes in the chill of early morning, his breath visible in the cold air of his cell. His body aches for warmth and food, yet he follows his brothers to the chapel. As the chants rise, his stomach growls loudly, echoing in his own ears. He feels shame, as though his hunger is a failure of faith. But with time he learns to embrace it, to let the hunger sharpen his prayers, to let it remind him that he is flesh striving toward spirit. The monastery's silence deepens the sense of discipline. During meals, which come hours later, monks often ate without speaking, listening instead to readings from scripture or the writings of saints. Food was fuel, never indulgence. The absence of breakfast fit perfectly into this vision. Mornings were for prayer, work and meditation, unbroken by the distraction of eating. Step into the cloister garden, and you find monks tending herbs and vegetables. Sage, thyme and rosemary grow in neat rows, their scents sharp in the cool air. Cabbages, beans and onions are cultivated with patience. These will become the midday meal, humble but sustaining. Yet in the morning, the monks labor without tasting them, enduring the hunger as a quiet sacrifice. Their work, like their prayers, is offered up as devotion. This spiritual fast also carried symbolic meaning. In denying breakfast, monks separated themselves from the world beyond the monastery walls. While peasants ate to fuel their labor, and nobles sometimes indulged in early feasts, the monk's refusal marked them as different, set apart, closer to heaven. His hunger was not weakness, but a badge of spiritual strength, and yet even in monasteries, human need could not be ignored entirely. Sick brothers were given food in the morning, their weakness treated with compassion rather than judgment. Travelers who sought shelter might also be offered a small meal, for hospitality was considered holy. But for the healthy monk, the rule remained no food before noon. Imagine the toll this took on the body. Hours of chanting, hours of manual labor, copying manuscripts, tending fields, building walls, all on an empty stomach. Yet in this endurance lay a sense of purpose. Hunger was woven into the very rhythm of the day, a thread that bound the body to the spirit. Each pang was a reminder of devotion. Each skipped meal, an act of worship. From the outside, the monastery's fast might seem harsh, but to those who lived within, it brought a strange kind of peace. By stripping away the distractions of food and indulgence, life was reduced to its essentials: prayer, work and community. The absence of breakfast was not an absence at all, but a space, a quiet, empty space where God might enter. Picture again the chapel. The monks gathered at dawn, their chants fill the air, rising and falling like waves. The candles flicker, the stone walls echo. Hunger gnaws at their stomachs, yet their voices do not falter. They sing not, despite their hunger, but through it, as though the emptiness itself gives power to their song. This discipline shaped not only their mornings, but their entire vision of life. To the monk the body was temporary, fragile, easily led astray. The soul was eternal, and it was the soul that mattered most. By refusing breakfast, by turning hunger into prayer, monks sought to strengthen what was eternal, while humbling what was fleeting. As we step back from the monastery, leaving its cold stone halls and echoing chants, we carry with us a new perspective. For peasants, breakfast was survival. For monks, its absence was salvation. Two worlds, one ruled by necessity, the other by devotion, both awakening under the same dawn. In the next stage of our journey, we will leave the cloisters and enter the halls of nobles, where mornings could shimmer with luxury, where breakfast, when taken, was not a sin, but a display of wealth. There bread and ale gave way to honey, cheese and roasted meats, and the meaning of the morning meal shifted once again. Step now from the quiet monastery into another world entirely, the world of the nobility, where monks greeted the morning with silence and hunger. Nobles often awakened to warmth, luxury, and the scent of food prepared by many hands. If the peasant's cottage was small, smoky, and humble, the noble's hall rose high, with stone walls, banners, and hearths so wide you could stand inside them. Imagine the dawn in such a hall. Curtains of heavy wool or linen are pulled back from carved wooden beds. The noble family rises not from straw pallets, but from mattresses stuffed with feathers or wool, draped in furs against the morning chill. Servants move quietly, stoking fires, carrying water, and preparing clothing. Outside, the estate bustles with activity, grooms tending horses, cooks in the kitchen, guards changing watch. Unlike peasants, nobles did not leap straight into labor. Their mornings were framed by comfort, ceremony, and often indulgence, and sometimes, that indulgence took the form of breakfast. For many nobles, eating in the morning was not routine. Like monks and priests, they too were aware of the suspicion around breakfast. To skip it could be a sign of refinement, a silent display that they did not need constant sustenance like common laborers. But when nobles chose to indulge, their breakfast revealed their wealth in dazzling detail. Picture the noble table, a long oak board, polished smooth, spread with linen cloth embroidered at the edges. Upon it platters gleam with offerings, wheels of cheese, white and yellow, aged until sharp or soft and creamy. Trays of honeycomb glisten in the firelight, golden liquid dripping slowly into shallow bowls. Freshly churned butter, pale and rich, waits beside loaves of wheat bread, the finest flour reserved for the wealthy, light and airy compared to the dense rye of the poor. There might be cold meats as well, roasted the night before, slices of venison, cuts of pork or fowl, seasoned with herbs. In wealthier households, spices from distant lands could transform even the simplest dishes. A sprinkle of cinnamon, a hint of nutmeg, the warmth of ginger carried across seas at staggering expense. Each bite was more than food, it was a symbol of power, proof that the noble family commanded both wealth and connections that stretched far beyond their lands. Drink, too, marked the difference. While peasants drank small ale for survival, nobles might sip spiced wine even in the morning. For them, alcohol was not only safe but fashionable, a way to begin the day with warmth and vigor. Imported fruits such as figs or dates preserved in honey might also appear on the table, luxuries unthinkable to those working in the fields outside the castle walls. Imagine the scene. The lord sits at the head of the table, his wife and children beside him, servants moving quietly to refill cups and arrange platters. Tapestries hang on the walls, telling stories of saints, battles or hunts. Dogs wait near the hearth, their eyes fixed hopefully on scraps that might fall. The air is filled with the scent of roasting meat, warm bread, and spiced drink, mingled with the smoke of the fire. This was breakfast not as necessity, but as display, a way to begin the day by reminding all who saw it of the family's status. Yet even among nobles, there was debate. Some criticized the morning feast as indulgence too close to gluttony. Others defended it, arguing that those who bore the weight of leadership required strength from the moment they rose. Much depended on the household itself. A cautious or pious lord might prefer to wait until midday, while a more worldly one indulged without hesitation. In truth, noble breakfasts reflected personality as much as tradition. One of the most striking differences between peasant and noble mornings was choice. The peasant ate what little he had without question. The noble, by contrast, could choose whether to eat or abstain, whether to take honey and cheese or to rise from the table untouched. That choice itself was a luxury, a mark of privilege as clear as the silver goblets and carved wooden trenchers. There were also occasions when breakfast became an event, a feast before a hunt, for example. Nobles often gathered in the early morning to ride out with horses, hounds and falcons. Before such exertion, a hearty meal was necessary. Tables would be set with roasted game, fresh bread, strong drink, and even sweet pastries made with honey or dried fruits. Laughter, conversation, and the eager bark of dogs filled the hall as preparations for the hunt began. In these moments, breakfast was not only fuel, but celebration. a communal ritual of wealth and power. And yet, despite all this splendor, nobles were not untouched by the same rhythms that shaped the lives of peasants and monks. The suspicion of breakfast lingered even here. Some mornings the table lay empty, the family content to wait until noon. At other times only the children might be served, for even in noble households it was recognized that the young needed food sooner than their elders. The line between indulgence and necessity was always shifting, always debated. Imagine now the servants who carried these platters and poured these drinks. For them the sight of noble breakfasts must have been both familiar and distant. They prepared the foods, smelled their sweetness, and sometimes tasted scraps, but they knew that their own mornings would begin with far humbler fare, if anything at all. In this way the noble breakfast was not only a meal, but a mirror of inequality, reflecting the gulf between those who had plenty and those who lived from crust to crust. To walk from a peasant's cottage into a noble's hall is to feel as though one has entered another world. Yet both rose to the same dawn, heard the same roosters crow, and felt the same chill of morning air. Their differences remind us that food, more than almost anything else, reveals the divisions of society. What one eats when one eats and whether one eats at all, these were not just personal choices, but signs of status, faith and survival. As we leave the noble's table, with its gleaming platters and fragrant wines, we carry with us an image of contrast. To some breakfast was sinful indulgence, to others it was a necessary strength. In noble halls it could be both at once, a feast when required, a fast when preferred, a stage upon which wealth and restraint both played their parts. In the next stage of our journey, we will turn our gaze not to bread or meat, but to drink itself. For in the medieval morning, ale, beer, and wine were as common as water, often safer, always meaningful, and woven deeply into the strange traditions of breakfast. Step now into the heart of medieval mornings, where bread might be scarce, but drink was almost always present. To the people of that age, liquid nourishment was not a luxury, nor simply an indulgence, but often a matter of survival. And in this world, ale, beer, and wine stood where water could not. For in the Middle Ages, water was a fickle companion. Wells could be pure, but streams and rivers carried waste, rot, and disease. To drink water without treatment was to take a gamble with sickness, a risk few wished to face each dawn. Brewing, however, transformed danger into safety. Through the process of boiling and fermenting, harmful elements were destroyed, leaving a liquid that could be trusted. Thus ale, beer, and wine became the everyday companions of both rich and poor, from the peasant's hut to the noble's hall. Begin with ale, the humble drink of the common folk. Picture a wooden mug filled not with the strong, bitter ale we know today, but with a weaker, gentler brew. This small ale, as it was called, carried little alcohol, but enough to keep it safe. Children drank it, the elderly drank it, and every laborer carried it as fuel for their long day ahead. At breakfast such ale was as common as bread, and in many cases more essential. For where grain was scarce, it could be stretched farther by brewing into drink, and each sip offered not only hydration, but a modest portion of calories. Brewing itself was often the work of women. In villages across Europe, the alewife was a familiar figure, preparing small batches to serve households and communities. The morning mug was thus not only a drink, but also a product of women's labor, a thread binding family and village together. To imagine breakfast without ale in a peasant household is to misunderstand entirely how deeply it was woven into life. Beer, though similar, took on different tones, stronger, richer, and in later centuries flavored with hops. Beer was more common in certain regions, especially in Northern Europe. To sip beer at breakfast was to feel warmth spread through the body, a gentle push against the chill of dawn. It was not only sustenance, but comfort, a way to begin the day with strength. For nobles, beer could be brewed to higher strength, spiced, or even imported from distant lands, turning a common drink into a mark of refinement. For peasants it remained steady, nourishing and practical, a silent companion to coarse bread or a piece of cheese. Wine, by contrast, told a different story. It flowed most abundantly in the south, in France, Italy, and Spain, where vineyards blanketed the hillsides. To sip wine at breakfast was to partake in both culture and class. The peasant might drink thin, sour wine, watered down just enough to quench thirst and provide energy. But in noble households, Wine could be sweet, rich, and spiced. Imagine a lord lifting a silver goblet of warm mulled wine at dawn, steam rising as cinnamon and cloves released their fragrance. It was not only nourishment, but ceremony, a declaration that the family's reach extended across oceans and trade routes. Wine also held sacred meaning. To drink it at morning meals was to echo the chalice of the Mass, a reminder that even daily nourishment carried echoes of divine ritual. In monasteries, watered wine might appear sparingly, a balance between necessity and humility. In cities, merchants and scholars might take a modest cup before their work began, a quiet nod to culture as well as sustenance. What is striking when we look across these drinks is how universal they were. Whether you were a child in a farmhouse, a knight preparing for the hunt, or a scholar in a city cloister, ale, beer, or wine almost certainly touched your lips before noon. This was the heartbeat of medieval breakfast, not the food upon the table, which varied wildly, but the drink that steadied hands, warmed bodies, and carried people into the day. Imagine now the sound of it, the clink of wooden mugs, the splash of liquid poured from clay jugs, the sigh of satisfaction as a cold morning was softened by warm drink. Even in silence, the act of drinking bound people together. Servants, laborers, lords and ladies all shared in this ritual, though the quality and richness of their cups might differ vastly. In this drink became both equalizer and divider, uniting all in habit, while reminding each of their place within society. It is tempting from our modern perspective to think of ale, beer and wine at breakfast as indulgence, but for them it was necessity. To wake without it would be to begin the day weak, parched, or unsafe. And so each morning mugs were lifted, lips were wet, and the day began, not with coffee or tea, but with these age-old brews. And yet even here, controversy lingered. Some clerics warned against drinking too early, lest it encourage sloth or sin. Others argued it was simply practical, a gift of God's creation used wisely. In noble households, moderation was praised, while excess was mocked or condemned. Among peasants, there was no luxury of debate. They drank what they had, and thanked Providence for it. As the sun climbed higher, so too did the role of these drinks change. The light ale of breakfast gave way to stronger midday brews, and then to the heavier cups of evening. But in that first hour of dawn, ale, beer and wine were more than refreshment. They were protection, sustenance, and tradition, all poured into humble mugs and golden goblets alike. Thus in the strange traditions of medieval breakfast, drink was the common thread that tied together rich and poor, sacred and profane, necessity and luxury. From the weak ale of the cottage to the spiced wine of the hall, it was always present, always essential, always shaping the rhythm of morning life. And so as we leave the table of drink, our journey leads us to another element of morning ritual, one not of sustenance, but of belief. For in the medieval mind, the breaking of fast was never just about bread or drink, but about sin, virtue, and the unseen battle between body and spirit. To understand this is to step deeper into the hidden world of medieval mornings. In the medieval world, the act of eating was never simply a matter of hunger or pleasure. Each bite, each sip, was measured not only by the body, but also by the soul. At the heart of this concern lay one of the most dreaded of the 7 deadly sins, gluttony. To overindulge, to crave food beyond need, was to risk not only physical discomfort, but eternal peril. And nowhere did this tension appear more vividly than in the quiet hours of the morning, when breakfast tested the balance between necessity and excess. To understand this, imagine stepping into a medieval monastery, where monks rose in the darkness before dawn. Their bodies, weary from long hours of prayer, might have craved bread or drink, yet their rule, such as that of Saint Benedict, often discouraged early meals. To eat too soon was seen as indulgence, a sign of weakness, an invitation to gluttony. Instead, monks were urged to wait until the appointed hour, usually midday, when their hunger was moderated by discipline. For them, fasting was not punishment, but a training of the spirit, a sharpening of will against temptation. Outside monastery walls, the same fear of gluttony lingered. Preachers warned peasants and nobles alike that to eat greedily in the morning was to live like animals, driven by the belly rather than the soul. Church sermons often painted vivid pictures. The man who ate before prayer was like a beast at the trough. The woman who could not resist food at dawn was thought to open herself to sloth and sin. The breakfast table thus became a stage for moral choices, where even the simplest act of lifting bread to the lips carried eternal weight. Yet the reality was never so clear. Hunger in the Middle Ages was not rare, but common. Fields failed, winters bit hard, and stores of grain ran low. For peasants to eat in the morning was often not a luxury but a survival instinct. The body could not work the plough or carry water on an empty stomach, and so despite sermons, peasants did break their fast early, though often with the simplest of meals, a crust of bread, a sip of ale. To them gluttony was a sin reserved for those with abundance, not for those scraping at the edge of want. Among the wealthy, however, the tension grew sharper. A nobleman's table could overflow with meat, cheese and sweetened wine, even at dawn. Here the danger of excess was real. Chronicles sometimes mocked lords who feasted too early, their indulgence seen as weakness. Satirical tales warned of men too sluggish from over-rich breakfasts to ride to battle, or women who lingered too long at morning tables, while duty waited. To eat richly in the morning risked not only spiritual condemnation, but also social ridicule. Consider also the symbolism attached to food. To eat with restraint was to signal virtue, control and discipline. A noble who chose only bread and watered wine at breakfast could project humility, aligning himself with the church's ideals, but one who devoured roast meats and spiced pastries at dawn risked being judged as gluttonous, greedy and unfit for leadership. Even kings were not immune to this judgment. Chronicles note that the mightiest rulers were praised for moderation, their measured meals presented as evidence of wisdom and piety. The fear of gluttony also wove itself into folk wisdom and medical thought. Physicians of the time believed that heavy meals early in the day disturbed the humors, the delicate balance of bodily fluids thought to govern health. A heavy breakfast could lead to sluggishness, melancholy, or even madness. Thus to eat lightly was not only spiritually safer but physically wiser. To gorge at dawn was seen as a threat not only to the soul but to the body's fragile harmony. And yet gluttony was not defined merely by quantity. To crave fine foods, to seek flavor above sustenance, was equally dangerous. Medieval texts warned against longing for spiced wine or sugared cakes, when plain bread would suffice. Desire itself unchecked was the root of gluttony. This meant that even a wealthy lord, nibbling delicately at a sweet pastry, might be judged more harshly than a ploughman devouring coarse bread after hours of toil. The sin was not in the food alone, but in the hunger of the heart. In monasteries, the danger of gluttony inspired elaborate rules. Some required brothers to eat in silence, lest conversation about food stir appetite into greed. Others imposed limits on variety, allowing only 1 or 2 dishes so that monks could not indulge choice. Meals were timed by bells, portioned by rank, and served in ritual fashion, all to ensure that the act of eating nourished the body without endangering the soul. Even breakfast, when permitted, was stripped of indulgence, a simple affair of bread, perhaps with watered wine, taken without ceremony. Yet in the larger world, people lived in shades of compromise. Merchants, travelers and workers could not always follow the strict codes preached from pulpits. A mason building the walls of a cathedral might need food at dawn to endure his labor, and no priest's warning could change the gnawing of his stomach. Over time, a practical balance emerged: light meals in the morning, heavier ones later. This pattern, though shaped by necessity, also answered the fear of gluttony, a way to eat without excess, to begin the day without indulgence. But even with such compromises, the whispers of guilt never fully disappeared. Medieval writers often reminded their readers that every meal was a test. Did you eat for strength or for pleasure? Did you drink to quench thirst or to indulge the tongue? Breakfast, humble as it seemed, could tip the scales between virtue and sin. And so each morning meal was shadowed by questions larger than hunger. A peasant at his wooden table might pause before biting bread, mindful of sermons warning against greed. A noble at his gilded hall might sip watered wine, feigning restraint to display virtue. A monk might resist food altogether until the appointed hour, believing that in hunger he drew closer to God. In each case, breakfast was never only breakfast, it was a mirror reflecting the battle between flesh and spirit, indulgence and discipline. Thus, when we think of medieval breakfast, we must see more than bread and ale. We must see a ritual weighted with meaning, a quiet struggle between body and soul. In that first meal of the day lay the seeds of virtue or vice, salvation or damnation. To eat was to live, but to eat wrongly was to sin. And so, in the strange traditions of medieval mornings, the simplest acts became the most profound: a crumb of bread, a sip of ale, a morsel of cheese, each carried within it not only the power to nourish the body, but to endanger the soul. Breakfast was not just a meal, it was a test, a ritual, a spiritual crossroad, where hunger met morality, and where the sin of gluttony lingered like a shadow at the edge of every table. When we speak of medieval breakfast, we must remember that Europe was never a single uniform world. Though the Church's sermons echoed from France to England and across Italy, each land carried its own rhythms, its own customs, its own ways of beginning the day. Just as dialects differed and architecture varied, so too did the morning table. In those early hours, before work began or prayers were finished, each region revealed its character through the foods it offered and the rituals that surrounded them. Let us begin in France, a land both rich and divided. For the peasants of the French countryside, the morning meal was often no more than a chunk of coarse bread, perhaps dipped in watered wine or warmed in a broth if fortune allowed. Cheese, though beloved, was not always at hand, reserved for days when the household's animals gave milk in abundance. Yet even in such simplicity, the French revealed a taste for balance. Farmers spoke of bread as the staff of life, and wine, even watered, as a small comfort against the chill of dawn. It was said that to start the day without bread was to begin already weakened, as though one were trying to walk with a broken stick. In the towns and cities of France, where bakers' ovens glowed before sunrise, breakfast sometimes carried a different shape. Here the scent of fresh bread, lighter, whiter, finer than the dark loaves of the countryside, drifted through narrow streets. Merchants and craftsmen might purchase a roll on their way to market, tearing pieces to eat as they walked. For those of higher standing, breakfast could be a small but refined meal: bread with soft cheese, perhaps a touch of honey, or even a sweetened drink made from spiced wine. It was never vast, never heavy, for to eat richly at dawn risked the stain of gluttony, but it bore a hint of elegance, a reflection of France's growing love for culinary refinement, a taste that would one day shape the whole of Europe. Move now across the Channel to England, where mornings carried a different flavour. The English countryside was fertile, its fields heavy with grain, its pastures dotted with sheep and cattle. Here peasants began their day early, often before the sun broke the horizon. Bread was once again the staple, coarse and hearty, but in England it was often paired with ale, that ever-present drink. A sip of ale at dawn was not a mark of indulgence, but of necessity. Its warmth and strength gave energy for long hours in the field, its safety, a blessing in a land where water could not always be trusted. In the great halls of the English nobility, breakfast carried a curious reputation. Some nobles chose to forego it, echoing the Church's warnings. To eat before noon, they claimed, is unseemly, a sign of weakness. Yet others embraced it, setting tables with bread, cold meats and cheese to strengthen themselves before hunts or councils. Chroniclers note that in times of war, soldiers in English armies were often granted a morning ration of bread and ale before battle, proof that even the noblest ideals bowed to necessity. Thus in England, breakfast was both frowned upon and quietly accepted, a meal caught between piety and pragmatism. But English mornings were also shaped by weather and work. In the damp chill of misty dawns, a warm bite was often welcome. Porridges made of oats or barley appeared on humble tables, filling and comforting. A spoonful of porridge could carry a man through the day's labor far more than a crumb of bread alone. And in this reliance on grain-based meals, we glimpse the English character: sturdy, practical, preferring strength over finery, substance over display. Now let us journey south to Italy, where the morning light poured differently upon stone streets and olive groves. In Italy, the rhythms of breakfast carried echoes of the Roman past. Here bread was again the anchor, but olive oil often accompanied it, drizzled lightly or used to soften stale loaves. Wine, watered and simple, was common too, though in warmer climates, fresh fruit sometimes appeared even in the morning. Figs, grapes or olives could be plucked and eaten at dawn, a reminder that in Italy, nature's bounty was closer at hand. Among the wealthy Italians, particularly in cities like Florence or Venice, breakfast sometimes hinted at the sophistication for which their lands were known. Merchants might enjoy sweetened breads, flavored with spices brought from the East, a luxury that spoke of trade and wealth. Honey, too, was more common here, drizzled over bread in golden streams, a touch of sweetness to greet the day. Yet even in Italy, restraint was praised. To linger too long over breakfast was seen as indulgent. Meals were light, quick, designed not to delay the business of the morning. In monasteries across these lands, France, England, Italy, the rules of breakfast were more uniform, shaped by the shared discipline of the church. Yet even here, small differences crept in. In French abbeys, the meal might include cheese and watered wine. In English cloisters, a bowl of pottage might be granted on feast days. In Italian monasteries, fruit or olives could appear alongside bread. These variations reflected not disobedience, but adaptation, a recognition that each region lived with its own climate, its own resources, its own necessities. The contrasts between regions tell us much about their people. The French, even in scarcity, lean toward refinement and balance, their breakfasts never grand but often thoughtful. The English embraced sturdiness and utility, bread and ale sustaining body and spirit through long damp days. The Italians, blessed by sun and soil, enjoyed lightness and freshness, their mornings graced by fruit and oil as much as by bread. Each table, though humble, carried the essence of its land, France's elegance, England's solidity, Italy's vitality. And yet, despite these differences, the same threads wove them together. Bread was universal, the one food that crossed every border, the one constant on every table. Wine or ale, too, bound them, though in different forms. Wine in the south, ale in the north, each shaped by climate and tradition. All feared gluttony, all respected restraint, all balanced between hunger's demand and morality's warning. Breakfast was never only nourishment, it was a reflection of identity, of geography, of culture itself. To wander through medieval Europe at dawn, then, was to hear many languages, and see many customs, but always to find some familiar rhythm in the breaking of the fast. A French peasant tearing bread into wine, an English farmer spooning porridge, an Italian merchant savoring honeyed bread. Each was part of the same great story, yet each spoke in a different accent, a different flavor. In this way, breakfast became not only a meal, but a mirror of Europe itself, diverse, divided yet bound by common threads. It revealed both difference and unity, both variety and sameness. And as the sun rose over fields and cities, the people of France, England, and Italy alike lifted bread to their lips and began the day, each in their own way, yet all under the same sky. In medieval Europe, the morning table was not only a place of nourishment, it was a stage where the drama of society unfolded. To sit down to breakfast, whether in a peasant's hut or a noble's hall, was to see the very structure of the world reflected in bread, cheese, and drink. Food was more than food, it was a marker of status, privilege, and survival, and few meals revealed that divide more clearly than the first of the day. Let us begin with the peasants, who formed the vast majority of the population. Their mornings were shaped not by choice but by necessity. A man rising before dawn to tend his lord's fields rarely lingered over a table. His breakfast was whatever could be eaten quickly and cheaply. A piece of yesterday's coarse bread, perhaps hardened with age, a mug of weak ale brewed at home, sometimes a smear of butter or cheese, if the family's cow had been generous. More often than not, it was plain bread alone, washed down with water if nothing else was at hand. Hunger was a constant shadow, and the morning meal was designed only to keep it at bay until midday. The bread itself told a story. For peasants it was dark, heavy, often made with barley, rye or oats, mixed with whatever filler grains could be found. Fine white wheat bread was rare, a luxury reserved for the rich. The peasant's loaf was dense, sometimes gritty, baked in communal ovens that served entire villages. To eat such bread was to taste the earth itself, coarse, unpolished, sustaining. It filled the belly, but it never spoke of elegance. For the poorest families, even bread could be uncertain. Failed harvests or harsh winters meant that breakfasts shrank to the barest minimum, a broth made of cabbage leaves perhaps, or porridge stretched thin with water. In times of famine, people were known to grind acorns into flour to bake bitter loaves. To wake each day not knowing whether breakfast would exist at all, was the reality of peasant life, a far cry from the steady abundance of noble tables. Now step into the world of the nobility, and the contrast is startling. Though the church often frowned on heavy meals in the morning, nobles could afford to bend such rules. Their breakfast might begin with the same bread as the peasants, but here it was white and soft, made from the finest milled wheat. To this nobles added rich accompaniments: cold cuts of meat left from the night before, fresh butter churned by servants, cheeses aged and flavored, even sweet pastries in later centuries. Honey was drizzled freely, spices sometimes sprinkled, wine poured instead of ale. While peasants rose hungry, nobles often woke to choice. They could select from meats or cheeses, sip sweetened drinks, or taste fruits rare in northern lands. The very act of eating well in the morning became a statement that one's life was not bound by toil, that one's wealth permitted comfort at any hour of the day. Even the setting of breakfast revealed division. The peasant ate in a dim, smoky hut, often standing or sitting on a rough stool, his food resting on a wooden board. The noble dined in a hall lit by high windows, seated on carved chairs, his bread served on polished trenchers, his drink poured into pewter or even silver vessels. Both ate bread, both drank, but one did so with haste and necessity, the other with ceremony and choice. Yet the noble's breakfast was not without its complexities. In theory, many lords and ladies claimed to disdain the morning meal, considering it a weakness. Chronicles mention great nobles boasting that they fasted until midday, and yet accounts also reveal that before hunts or journeys, tables were laden with bread, meat, cheese and wine to prepare the household for exertion. Servants recorded such meals carefully, for nothing in a noble's household went unnoticed. The contradiction was clear: nobles condemned breakfast in word, but embraced it in practice, bending rules to their advantage while peasants endured hunger in silence. Children, too, were shaped by this divide. A peasant child often began the day with only a bite of bread, if any at all, while the noble child might be given warm milk, honeyed bread, or fruit to strengthen the body and please the palate. From the earliest years, society's hierarchy was tasted, learned, and reinforced at the breakfast table. But there was more than wealth at play. The divide also revealed how each class related to time. For peasants, the day began at dawn and ended at dusk, every hour spent in labor. Breakfast was fuel consumed quickly, before heading to the fields. For nobles, the day was more flexible. Leisure allowed for a slower morning, a choice to eat or to wait, to indulge or to abstain. Time itself, as much as bread and wine, was a luxury of the upper class. There were moments, however, when these two worlds brushed against each other. During great feasts or festivals, peasants might be granted food from their lord's table, leftovers distributed as alms. On such mornings, the poor tasted meat or white bread, rarely seen in their huts, brief glimpses into a life forever out of reach. Conversely, nobles traveling through their estates sometimes dined simply, taking a rustic breakfast of coarse bread and ale, to appear closer to their tenants. These encounters were fleeting, but they underscored the gulf between the two classes, a gulf that bread, the most basic of foods, both bridged and widened. It is worth noting, too, that servants lived in a curious in-between. They often ate better than peasants, for they shared in the scraps of noble kitchens, yet they remained dependent, their meals always second-hand. A servant's breakfast might include bread and cheese, sometimes broth, occasionally even the remnants of roasted meat, but it was never their own, always the leftovers of another's wealth. The divide between noble and peasant breakfasts was not only about food, it was about power. To eat richly at dawn was to signal dominance, to demonstrate freedom from hunger's tyranny. To scrape together crumbs was to embody the struggle of survival. Every morning across Europe, the first meal of the day reminded people of their place in the order of the world. And yet, for all their differences, nobles and peasants were bound together. Both began their days with bread, both needed food to carry them into labor or leisure. In this way, breakfast was a shared ritual, though unequal in form. It was a daily drama of contrast, one table heavy, the other bare, but it was still at its heart the same human act, the breaking of the night's fast, the preparation for another day, under the same rising sun. In the end, breakfast for nobles and peasants was more than a meal. It was a mirror of medieval society itself, divided, unequal, yet inescapably connected. At dawn, whether in a smoky hut or a grand hall, People lifted bread to their lips and remembered, consciously or not, the hierarchy into which they had been born. The noble's feast and the peasant's crust were two sides of the same coin, each defining and reinforcing the other, and with every bite, the order of the world was renewed. Within the stone walls of monasteries and convents, breakfast was not simply a matter of appetite, it was a question of discipline, obedience, and spiritual purpose. For the men and women who had turned away from worldly life to serve God, food was never just food, it was a moral test, a reminder of humility, and a daily expression of faith. And so, when the bell tolled in the early hours of the medieval morning, the way monks and nuns broke their fast carried deep significance. The rule of Saint Benedict, one of the most influential guides to monastic life in the West, set the tone. Written in the 6th century but shaping monasteries for centuries afterward, it laid out clear expectations for when and how meals should be taken. Benedict advised moderation, simplicity and restraint. The day was to be marked by prayer, work and study, not by indulgence at the table. Eating was necessary, but it was never to be enjoyed too freely. According to Benedict's rule, monks typically ate only 2 meals a day, one around midday and another in the evening. This meant that in theory, there was no breakfast at all. To eat in the morning was to risk indulgence, to give in too easily to the body's desires. Fasting until noon was seen as a discipline of the spirit, training the monk to place prayer above hunger, and yet life inside monasteries was never quite so rigid in practice. Exceptions crept in, shaped by human need, by climate, and by circumstance. In colder regions, where dawn work was hard and days long, allowances were made for a small morning refreshment. This might be bread dipped in watered wine, or a bowl of thin pottage to warm the body. In some monasteries, sick monks, or those engaged in heavy labor, were excused from strict fasting, given food early to sustain their strength. For nuns too, the pattern was similar. Cloistered behind convent walls, their days revolved around prayer and service. Officially, they followed the same discipline of delayed meals, but practical concerns sometimes softened the rules. A nun who rose in the dark hours to chant the night offices might be offered a sip of ale or a bite of bread afterward, just enough to carry her until the day's first proper meal. The morning silence of monasteries was profound. Picture a stone refectory, its long wooden tables stretching beneath high arched ceilings. The monks file in, hoods drawn low, hands folded. They sit not to chatter, but to listen, for as they eat one brother reads aloud from scripture, or from the lives of the saints. In such a setting, even a small morning allowance was not an indulgence, but part of the rhythm of discipline. Bread was broken not for pleasure, but for strength to pray, to copy manuscripts, to till the monastery fields. The austerity of monastic breakfasts also reflected the broader Christian suspicion of morning meals. For much of the Middle Ages, the Church taught that eating too early suggested gluttony, an unwillingness to control the stomach. To resist breakfast was to rise above the animal needs of the flesh. Monks and nuns whose lives were dedicated to holiness were expected to embody that resistance. But monasteries were also centers of hospitality. Travelers, pilgrims, and the poor often sought refuge within their walls, and here breakfast could take on another form. Guests were not bound by the same rules of fasting. A weary pilgrim arriving at dawn might be offered bread, cheese, and ale to restore his strength, even as the monks themselves continued to fast. In this way, monasteries demonstrated both discipline and charity, strict with themselves, generous with others. There were also special times when exceptions became the rule. During Lent, for example, fasting grew even stricter, meals reduced to 1 a day, but in the long winter months, monasteries in northern Europe often relaxed the timetable, allowing small morning portions to prevent illness. The balance between devotion and practicality was a constant negotiation, and the monastic breakfast, or its absence, was a symbol of that struggle. Over time, as the Middle Ages wore on, the rigor of monastic life softened in many places. By the 13th and 14th centuries, chronicles complain of monks who ate more freely, who began to expect morning meals as part of the daily routine. Critics accused them of straying from Benedict's original rule, of turning the monastery into a place of comfort, rather than sacrifice. Records show that in some wealthy abbeys, monks were served bread, ale, cheese and even meat at dawn, far removed from the austere fasting of their founders. Breakfast, once suspect, was slowly becoming accepted. Yet even in its most generous form, the monastic morning meal remained simple compared to the feasts of nobles. It was plain bread, not sugared pastries, ale or watered wine, not spiced hippocras, porridge or broth, not roasted meats. The purpose was never indulgence, but balance enough to work and pray, not enough to distract the soul from God. The symbolism ran deep. To eat sparingly at dawn was to imitate Christ, who fasted in the wilderness. To restrain one's appetite was to keep the body in check, a reminder that earthly hunger was nothing compared to spiritual longing. Every mouthful was taken with prayer, every crumb a lesson in humility. Still, behind the walls of monasteries, human weakness remained. There are tales of monks sneaking extra bread, of abbots scolding brothers for indulging in early feasts, of tensions between those who clung to strict fasting and those who argued for mercy on the body. These stories remind us that monks and nuns were not saints carved from stone. They were people wrestling with hunger and desire, seeking holiness, yet always aware of the pull of their humanity. In the quiet of dawn, when candles flickered in the choir stalls and the chant of prayers rose into vaulted ceilings, breakfast was less about food than about meaning. A crust of bread, given after a night of prayer, a sip of ale before a long day in the fields. These were not luxuries, but tokens of endurance. The discipline of waiting until noon, or the exception of eating at dawn, both spoke of the same truth, that for the monastic world, every meal was a negotiation between body and spirit. Thus, the story of monastic breakfasts is not one of abundance or delight, but of restraint, adaptation, and devotion. In their silence, in their fasting, in their carefully measured exceptions, monks and nuns turned the ordinary act of eating into a spiritual exercise. And so, even in the simplest morning crust, they found a way to serve God. If the monasteries, castles, and village hearths followed their own rules of fasting and discipline, what of those who lived at the edges of medieval society? What of children whose growing bodies demanded food at dawn? What of travelers who rose in strange lands and had to rely on what strangers offered them? And what of outsiders, the poor, the wandering, the marginalized, who often began each day not with a planned meal, but with the uncertainty of whether they would eat at all? The medieval world was not uniform. Its rules about breakfast, who should eat it, who should avoid it, and who was granted exceptions, shifted depending on age, occupation, and circumstance. In many ways, the experience of breakfast reveals the lines that divided medieval society between privilege and poverty, between discipline and necessity, between those who had the power to follow rules and those who simply had to survive. Children and the morning hunger. In theory, even children were expected to follow the rhythms of fasting that adults observed. The church and household discipline often encouraged youngsters to delay eating until the proper time of day. Yet, in practice, this was rarely possible. A child sent to the fields, or to school, or simply playing among village lanes could not endure long hours on an empty stomach. Parents, knowing this, often softened the rules. For children, breakfast was simpler and more forgiving than for their elders. A piece of bread dipped in milk, a small bowl of pottage, or an apple from the orchard might be offered at dawn. Rural children often had access to food as part of their chores, drinking a little warm milk straight from the cow, nibbling bread given by a parent already awake to bake, or chewing on dried fruit left over from the night before. These small indulgences were rarely condemned, for the church recognized that growing bodies needed sustenance. Even the stern voices of discipline allowed for mercy when it came to the youngest. And so in medieval homes one might see children eating early while adults waited for the official meal. Their laughter, their crumbs scattered across the rushes on the floor, spoke of a world less bound by rigid rules. In them breakfast survived in its simplest form, not a meal to celebrate but a necessity born of youth and need. Travelers on the road. For travelers, breakfast was often a matter of chance. The roads of medieval Europe stretched across forests, fields, and towns, dotted with inns, monasteries, and hospitable homes. A pilgrim rising at dawn on the road to Santiago de Compostela, or Canterbury, did not always know where his next meal would come from. Inns and taverns were among the few places where breakfast might be purchased. These meals were rarely elaborate. A traveler could expect coarse bread, a mug of ale or watered wine, and perhaps some cheese or cured meat if the innkeeper was generous. For merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims, this was enough to begin a long day's journey. The wealthy fared differently. A noble traveling with attendants might rise to a table set with meat pies, fresh bread, and warm spiced wine. His servants would ensure that he was fed even on the road, but such luxuries were rare. For the ordinary wayfarer, breakfast was uncertain, a gift if it was found, a trial if it was not. Monasteries played a special role in sustaining travelers. Many abbeys opened their doors to pilgrims, offering them food in the morning even when the monks themselves fasted until noon. For weary souls arriving at dawn, this generosity could mean survival. A crust of bread and a bowl of pottage might seem little, but to a traveler, it was a blessing, a sign of God's mercy shown through human kindness. The poor and the marginalized. For the poorest in medieval society, breakfast was often non-existent. A beggar in the city streets might wake to hunger with no certainty of food until he could secure alms. For the landless laborer, breakfast depended on the generosity of employers or neighbors. In rural villages, those who owned no land might rely on scraps offered by wealthier households, often whatever was left from the previous night's supper. The poor were sometimes fed as part of charity, especially near churches or monasteries. On feast days, bread and ale were distributed to those in need, sometimes early in the morning. Yet on ordinary days, survival meant improvisation. A handful of wild berries, a crust begged from a baker, or a cup of thin ale might serve as breakfast if fortune smiled. This precariousness shaped the rhythm of their lives. For the poor, breakfast was not a matter of choice but of chance. Unlike the nobleman who might disdain early meals as gluttony, or the monk who fasted for discipline, the beggar simply endured hunger until food appeared. The rules of breakfast meant little to those for whom rules themselves were luxuries. Outsiders and foreigners. Medieval Europe was not without its outsiders. Jews traveling, Romani groups, foreign merchants or strangers from distant lands. Their traditions sometimes clashed with local expectations. Jewish communities, for instance, often ate modest breakfasts of bread and cheese or small cakes, shaped by their own dietary laws. To Christian neighbors, these habits could seem unusual, further marking difference in an already divided world. Foreign travelers brought other customs. Merchants from the Islamic world, accustomed to dates, nuts, and morning milk, often found European fare coarse and sparse. To them the absence of a proper breakfast seemed strange. Their presence in bustling trade cities added new flavors to the morning meal, slowly influencing local tastes. In this way, breakfast became a small stage upon which cultures met, clashed, and blended. The symbolism of exception, what unites children, travelers, the poor, and outsiders, is that each group was granted, or claimed, exceptions to the general suspicion of breakfast. The child ate because of youth, the traveler ate because of necessity, the poor ate when and what they could, rules be forgotten. Outsiders ate according to their own traditions, indifferent to the moralizing voices of their hosts. This revealed something profound about the medieval world. Rules were never absolute. They bent under the weight of human need. Breakfast, though frowned upon in principle, survived because life itself demanded it. The body could not be ignored, and so across society, the early meal persisted in small scattered forms, never celebrated, often hidden, but always present. A morning of contrasts. Imagine a medieval morning, just as dawn breaks. In the manor house, a noble waits until later in the day to dine, declaring that to eat early would be a weakness. In the monastery, monks kneel in prayer, their stomachs growling, but their discipline firm. Yet in a nearby village, a child bites into warm bread, fresh from the oven, her laughter rising into the cold air. A pilgrim trudges past, clutching a crust given by a kindly innkeeper. A beggar stirs in the street, uncertain if today will bring food at all. This tapestry of difference reminds us that medieval breakfasts were never uniform. They were shaped by circumstance, by privilege, by need, and by mercy. And in these exceptions, we glimpse the humanity of an age often remembered only for its rules. Beneath the weight of discipline and doctrine, there were always moments of hunger met with kindness, of rules softened for the sake of life. Thus, breakfast in the medieval world was not just about food. It was about who you were, where you stood in society, and what burdens or blessings you carried at dawn. For some it was a luxury forbidden, for others it was survival demanded. And in that contrast lies the story of how a single meal, or the lack of it, could reveal the very heart of medieval life. For centuries, breakfast had carried with it the faint scent of suspicion, a meal whispered about but rarely celebrated. To eat early was once a sign of weakness, a failure to endure the morning's fast with discipline. Yet time does not stand still, and slowly, quietly, the reputation of breakfast began to change. By the later Middle Ages, and into the dawn of early modern Europe, the morning meal that had once seemed shameful began to find a place of honor. The shift was gradual, but it revealed the way food, culture, and society constantly reshaped one another. One of the strongest forces behind this change was simple necessity. As towns and cities grew, life became more demanding. Artisans rose before the sun to work their trades. Laborers carried heavy loads to bustling markets, and merchants spent long hours negotiating business in crowded streets. The needs of the body could not be ignored, and it became increasingly impractical to wait until noon to eat. A small meal in the morning gave strength to work, and slowly what had once been frowned upon began to seem sensible. Work, not indulgence, justified the first meal of the day. The church too began to soften its stance, though not without reluctance. Fasting still mattered, and discipline remained a virtue, but even within monasteries there were quiet shifts. Travelers and guests were often offered food at dawn, and in time, so too were those who labored hard. Gradually the rules of abstinence bent toward mercy. It became accepted that not every stomach could remain empty until midday. The soul might still aspire to discipline, but the body demanded sustenance. A new balance emerged between principle and practicality. By the 15th century, written records began to speak of breakfast more openly. Household accounts listed food prepared for the morning. Physicians, influenced by both classical thought and practical observation, recommended that a light meal upon waking could benefit health. They argued that the body, weakened by the night's long fast, required nourishment to regain strength. Slowly the language of medicine replaced the language of sin, and breakfast began to acquire respectability. To eat in the morning was not merely to indulge, it was to preserve one's health. Among the wealthy, breakfast even began to take on a note of luxury. Nobles and gentry, no longer fearful of appearing gluttonous, allowed themselves morning banquets of bread, wine, and spiced meats. The growing trade networks of Europe brought new delights to the table: dried fruits from the Mediterranean, imported spices, sugar, and eventually coffee and chocolate in later centuries. What had once been condemned as a suspicious indulgence became a display of refinement and wealth. Guests could be impressed not only by the grandeur of dinner, but also by the elegance of a well-served breakfast. For the middling classes, breakfast became a signal of order and respectability. A craftsman who fed his household in the morning showed responsibility. A merchant who offered guests a morning meal displayed hospitality. The meal began to shed its reputation as something sneaky or shameful. Instead, it grew into a symbol of domestic care, social polish, and even prosperity. To offer a proper breakfast became a mark of status, a way of showing that one's household was stable, well supplied, and attentive to both health and hospitality. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the meal was less about display and more about endurance. Farmers and shepherds had always eaten something at dawn, for their work left no choice. But now this necessity aligned with broader cultural change. What once had been hidden or excused as unusual was now quietly validated. If nobles and townsfolk spoke openly of breakfast, then peasants too could regard their morning bread and ale not as a guilty need, but as a rightful part of daily life. This shift was not only practical, but also cultural. Literature, art, and letters from the late Middle Ages onward began to mention breakfast without embarrassment. Where earlier texts had painted it as suspicious, later ones described it with warmth or casual acceptance. A scene of a family gathered in the morning became not a scandal, but a glimpse of ordinary life. The stigma had faded, replaced by an emerging sense that breakfast belonged as much to the rhythm of the day as supper or dinner. By the time Europe stood on the threshold of the Renaissance, the transformation was nearly complete. Breakfast had moved from suspicion to respectability, from the margins to the center of daily routine. Though not yet the elaborate morning feast of later centuries, it was acknowledged, spoken of, and respected. What had once marked weakness now symbolized care for health and readiness for labor. The very word breakfast, breaking the night's fast, began to carry not shame but simple truth. It is striking to reflect on how such a change occurred. Nothing dramatic announced it. There was no grand decree, no sudden revolution. Rather, it was the quiet accumulation of small necessities, the bending of rules, the voice of physicians, the spread of new goods, and the shifting expectations of work and society. Step by step, a meal once disdained became accepted. The sun rose each day, people awoke hungry, and over time, custom bent to reality. Thus breakfast found its place, not as a guilty indulgence, but as a natural beginning, a sign of readiness for the day's labor, a gesture of care within households, and eventually even a symbol of refinement. The story of breakfast's redemption is a story of how societies change, slowly, unevenly, but always in response to the needs of life. Where once people whispered of sin, they now spoke of health, duty, and even delight. And so, as Europe moved forward, breakfast became not only respectable but cherished. It had survived suspicion and outlived its critics. By the time new worlds of trade, discovery, and culture opened in the centuries to come, breakfast was no longer in doubt. It had become a daily ritual, woven into the fabric of life, a quiet triumph of hunger over hesitation, of need over doctrine, of humanity over fear. When we look back across the long arc of history, breakfast in the medieval world may seem small, almost ordinary, a crust of bread, a cup of ale, perhaps a bowl of pottage. Yet beneath its simplicity lies a story of transformation, of how human needs, cultural anxieties, and shifting values shaped even the most basic of daily rituals. The story of medieval breakfast is not only about food, but about the evolving relationship between the body, the soul, and society itself. What began as a suspect habit, something whispered of as weakness or indulgence, slowly became a practice accepted and eventually embraced. At first, only those on the edges of respectability partook openly: laborers who could not afford to wait until noon, travelers who needed strength, the sick who required nourishment. For them, survival came before reputation. But over time, their necessity became everyone's reality. The demands of urban life, the voices of physicians, and the gradual softening of church strictures paved the way for a meal once hidden to step into the light of respectability. In this slow acceptance, we can glimpse something timeless: the way culture bends to meet the needs of life. Doctrine may try to deny hunger, yet hunger persists. Customs may frown upon a practice, yet practice continues in quiet corners until one day it is no longer seen as shameful. Breakfast, once whispered about, became spoken of freely, then celebrated. It is a reminder that what seems natural to us today was once controversial, debated, and even condemned. The legacy of medieval breakfast lingers in subtle ways. Even now, our attitudes toward the morning meal carry echoes of the past. We still debate whether breakfast is the most important meal of the day, whether to eat lightly or indulge, whether it is a sign of discipline to begin with porridge and fruit, or a comfort to savor pastries and rich coffee. In each of these choices lies the shadow of earlier centuries, when questions of health, morality, and status shaped how one broke the fast. Breakfast also teaches us about the intertwining of class and food. For peasants, it was always necessity: bread, ale, something warm if fortune allowed. For nobles, it became in time a statement of refinement, flavored with imported spices and sweetened with sugar. Between these extremes stretched the broad fabric of society, each adapting the morning meal to their needs, their resources, and their values. What unites them all is the simple fact that the body must be fed. In this way, breakfast becomes both humbling and universal, a reminder that whatever our station, hunger greets us each morning. There is also a deeper spiritual lesson hidden in this history. For medieval people, food was never only about nourishment. It was about meaning. To eat was to wrestle with questions of sin and virtue, indulgence and restraint, body and soul. Breakfast, with its awkward position at the beginning of the day, forced these questions into sharper focus. To partake was to balance human weakness with divine expectation. To abstain was to prove strength, but sometimes at the cost of health. In the gradual acceptance of breakfast, we see the delicate dance between faith and flesh, between the ideals we aspire to and the realities we must live. And so the legacy of medieval breakfast is more than the memory of bread and ale. It is the story of adaptation, of humanity's resilience in finding harmony between need and belief. It reminds us that even the simplest acts, eating a crust of bread in the morning light are shaped by centuries of history, by struggles between doctrine and desire, by quiet acts of defiance that become traditions. As we close this journey through the world of medieval breakfasts, imagine for a moment those who lived so long ago: a farmer rising before dawn, breaking a loaf to share with his family before leading the oxen to the fields, a monk quietly sipping broth in the cloister, permitted at last by mercy to ease his hunger, a merchant welcoming a guest with bread and wine, proud to display his household's hospitality. These scenes, humble yet profound, remind us that history is not only written in battles and crowns, but in meals, in rituals, in the ways people chose to begin their day. The strange traditions around medieval breakfast were not merely quirks of the past, they were steps in an ongoing human story, the search for balance between survival and meaning, between appetite and virtue, between the demands of the world and the longings of the heart. To reflect on them is to see ourselves more clearly, for though centuries separate us, the morning hunger that called to them is the same hunger that greets us still. Though centuries have passed since the age of castles, monasteries, and peasant villages, the image of medieval breakfasts has never truly disappeared. In fact, these strange and sometimes contradictory traditions still echo in our modern imagination, shaping the way we think about food, health, and culture. To explore this afterlife of medieval breakfast is to uncover the subtle threads that connect the morning meals of long ago with the choices we make each dawn today. In literature and popular media, the medieval morning meal often becomes a symbol. Novelists describe the clatter of trenchers being set upon wooden tables, the smell of porridge steaming in smoky halls, the jugs of ale poured even before the sun has risen. Filmmakers love to frame these images with candlelight and heavy oak furniture, using food to set the atmosphere of another age. Breakfast in these depictions is not just sustenance, it is shorthand for the otherness of medieval life, a way of drawing the audience into a world that feels both familiar and foreign. Through these portrayals, the medieval breakfast survives as a cultural memory, reinforcing the romance of the Middle Ages while also highlighting its hardships. But the influence goes deeper than mere imagery. Some of our modern habits and health debates mirror medieval anxieties more than we might expect. Consider the continuing arguments about whether breakfast should be skipped or embraced. Today, nutritionists and doctors disagree. Some champion breakfast as the cornerstone of health, while others suggest intermittent fasting as a path to wellness. These debates echo the medieval tensions between abstinence and indulgence, discipline and necessity. Just as monks once hesitated to eat in the early morning for fear of appearing weak, so too do many today experiment with fasting windows, seeking strength and purity through restraint. In this way, the ghosts of medieval thought walk silently alongside modern diets. Our fascination with traditional foods also carries an echo of the past. The rise of rustic breads, porridges made with ancient grains, and simple hearty stews on modern menus reflects a longing for authenticity, for a taste of what feels older, purer, closer to the earth. Medieval breakfasts, humble as they were, fit this longing perfectly. The grainy loaf, the warm broth, the mug of ale or small beer, these foods now inspire craft bakeries, heritage breweries, and farm-to-table philosophies. We see in them not poverty or limitation, but a kind of wholeness, a return to basics that feels comforting in a world of processed abundance. There is also a moral imagination at play. In the medieval world, food carried meaning, spiritual, social, and ethical. To eat was to make a statement about one's discipline, one's faith, or one's generosity. Today we may not frame breakfast in overtly religious terms, but we still attach moral weight to our choices. A bowl of oats and fruit is praised as virtuous, while a plate of bacon and pancakes may be quietly judged as indulgent. Advertisements even use language that echoes sermons: pure, clean, sinful, guilty pleasure. In this way, the medieval link between food and morality has never been broken, it has simply been translated into a modern tongue. Beyond these cultural echoes, the medieval breakfast also lingers in our collective imagination as a symbol of community. Stories of villagers sharing bread around the fire, of monasteries feeding the poor at dawn, or of noble households displaying generosity through morning feasts, remind us that meals were never just individual acts. They were gatherings, moments of connection, rituals of belonging. In today's fast-paced world, where many people eat breakfast alone in cars or at desks, the image of medieval community breakfasts carries a nostalgic pull. It speaks to our enduring desire to begin the day, not in isolation, but in the company of others. Interestingly, even the suspicion of breakfast has survived in small ways. For centuries, breakfast was considered unnecessary or unhealthy, a habit of the poor. While we no longer see it as shameful, traces of that suspicion remain. Some people boast of only needing coffee to get through the morning, as if endurance were a badge of honor. Others view a heavy breakfast with disdain, linking it to laziness. These lingering attitudes remind us that cultural meanings are slow to fade. They evolve, soften, and reappear in new forms. The afterlife of medieval breakfast is not confined to serious reflection, it also thrives in humor and imagination. Medieval banquets and meals are popular subjects in festivals, reenactments, and even memes. Visitors to Renaissance fairs often find themselves eating turkey legs or thick breads, as if stepping back in time. While not always historically accurate, these playful acts show how food remains one of the most powerful bridges between past and present. Through the simple act of eating, we can feel connected to people who lived hundreds of years ago, sharing in something universal and timeless. And so the medieval breakfast lives on, not just in dusty manuscripts or monastic records, but in our kitchens, our debates, our art, and our imagination. It endures in the way we argue about nutrition, in the rustic breads we cherish, in the moral tones we assign to food, and in the longing we feel for communal tables at dawn. What was once dismissed as a weakness has become, over centuries, a site of meaning, memory, and even creativity. To speak of the afterlife of medieval breakfast is to recognize that history never fully disappears. The past does not end, it lingers, whispers, and re-emerges in ways both subtle and striking. Each time we sit down with bread and coffee, cereal and milk, or fruit and tea, we are not only beginning our day, we are continuing a story begun long ago, in fields and cloisters, in castles and cottages, in times when breakfast was strange, suspect, and yet utterly human. Morning is not merely the beginning of a new day, it is a timeless ritual, a cycle that repeats itself across generations, cultures, and centuries. In the medieval world, this ritual took many forms: the faint tolling of monastery bells at dawn, the slow stirring of peasants rising from straw beds, the crackle of fires being rekindled in darkened hearths, and the first breaking of bread. Though we no longer live in castles or cottages of the Middle Ages, the essence of morning, the way it shapes human rhythm, meaning, and memory, remains with us still. To look at the eternal return of morning rituals is to see how past and present fold into one another, weaving continuity from the fragments of history. Every dawn in the medieval world began with light struggling against darkness. Before the sun rose, shadows stretched across fields, narrow streets, and cloisters. The transition from night to morning was more than a practical shift. It carried spiritual weight. For monks, the hour of matins was a call to rise and pray, aligning themselves with the divine rhythm of time. For farmers, the first light was a signal to labor, reminding them that survival depended on seizing every usable moment. And for nobles, morning meant the start of business, alliances, or journeys. In each case, the act of rising and beginning the day formed a pattern that was not just necessity but ritual, a small reenactment of renewal, of the world itself awakening. We too enact this ritual today, though in different ways. The sound of alarm clocks has replaced bells, the glow of electric lamps replaces flickering torches, and the aroma of coffee has taken the place of ale or broth. Yet beneath these differences, the rhythm is the same. We rise, we refresh ourselves, we eat, we prepare. Like the medieval peasant pulling on rough wool, or the monk adjusting his robes, we dress for the day ahead, marking the passage from private night to public morning. Rituals, even the smallest ones, remind us that we are part of an ancient continuity of beginnings. One of the most striking features of morning rituals is their universality. From east to west, from medieval Europe to far older civilizations, humans have always given shape to their mornings with repeated actions. Whether it was washing hands in sacred water, offering prayers, lighting fires, or eating a first meal, these rituals signaled both survival and significance. They told people, this day matters, this beginning has meaning. The medieval breakfast, strange as it was, sometimes resisted, sometimes embraced, was part of that same eternal pattern. It marked the threshold between sleep and labor, between vulnerability and endurance. The medieval people may not have seen their breakfasts as rituals in the formal sense, yet they carried ritual power. A crust of bread dipped into ale could be a prayer in disguise, a way of thanking God for another day of life. A shared bowl of porridge could bind a family or a village together, strengthening bonds through the simplest form of generosity. Even the refusal to eat at dawn, whether for religious devotion or self-discipline, was itself a ritual of denial, a way of turning the morning into an act of meaning. The eternal return is not about what is eaten or refused, but about the rhythm of choice, of pattern, of repetition. Modern mornings carry this legacy in subtle but powerful ways. Think of the countless people who begin their day with coffee or tea, not only for energy, but because it feels wrong to begin without it. The cup, steaming in one's hands, is not merely a drink, it is a signal, a ritual marker that says the day has begun. Others find the same meaning in reading the news, in stretching, in meditation, or in sitting quietly with a spouse or child before the rush begins. These are echoes of the medieval rhythms, reshaped but recognizable. The form changes, the essence endures. There is also a psychological dimension to these rituals. Mornings hold power precisely because they repeat. In repetition, we find stability. In stability, we find comfort. The medieval villager could not control the harvest or the weather, but he could rise each day, light a fire, and share bread with his kin. Likewise, modern people cannot control every demand or challenge that awaits, but we can return to small rituals that steady us: coffee, breakfast, prayer, or silence. The eternal return gives life its rhythm, even in the face of uncertainty. Perhaps this is why mornings, more than any other time of day, inspire reflection about life itself. To begin again is to acknowledge that time moves forward, yet circles back. Each dawn feels both new and familiar, a reminder of all the mornings that have come before. When medieval monks sang their dawn prayers, they believed they were joining not only their brethren in nearby cloisters, but all those who had prayed before them. When we eat breakfast today, we too join a long chain, not just our families, but centuries of human beings, who have risen and sought nourishment at the threshold of light. The eternal return of morning rituals also carries a profound lesson. What seems ordinary is in fact sacred. The breaking of bread, whether in a medieval hall or a modern kitchen, is not just about hunger, it is about acknowledging life. The warmth of food, the act of sharing, the moment of pause before the day's labors, all of these are charged with quiet meaning. Medieval people understood this instinctively, even if they did not put it into words. We in our fast-moving world often need reminders to see it again. And so, as we trace the strange traditions of medieval breakfast through history, we arrive at a truth larger than food itself. The breakfast was never only about eating, it was about belonging, about rhythm, about the eternal act of beginning. To this day, every time the sun rises and people sit together, alone or in company, to take nourishment before work, we are reenacting an ancient cycle. The world turns, the day begins, and humanity remembers, through ritual, that it has done this countless times before. The eternal return of morning rituals tells us that no action, however small, is without weight. To lift a cup, to tear a piece of bread, to greet the morning light, these are the gestures that weave continuity between centuries. In every dawn we find not only a beginning, but a reflection of all the mornings that have ever been. And perhaps as we sip our first drink or taste our first bite, we are closer than we realize to those medieval villagers and monks, living out the same eternal rhythm of waking, eating, and beginning again.